IEDs against American and Iraqi troops. So it does seem to be getting more complicated, not less. Thank you, Linda. Back home, the political calculus continues to shift. Last week, we talked about Connecticut Senator Joe Lieberman and how his reputation as a moderate Democrat was hurting his re-election chances on the left. This week, we flipped the script. In Rhode Island, Republican moderate Lincoln Chafee is encountering rough waters in his renomination bid on the right. How are these two campaigns similar, and how are they different, Jean?
Well, they're very similar. Chafee and Joe Lieberman were out of step with their base. And in the case of Lieberman, he was pro-war. In the case of Chafee, he's anti-war. So they're moderates, but they're reverse images of moderates for each party. Chafee was the only Republican to vote against the war. He voted against some of the president's tax cuts. He didn't even vote for the president for re-election. This really made some of the Republicans up there angry. He wrote in the president's father's name as opposed to voting for the son. So they're very similar in that he's getting a push from the right-wing base, just like Lieberman got it from the left-wing activists who are frustrated with what's happening in Washington. Now, there are key differences as well. Chafee, unlike Lieberman, saw this coming when he wrote in George H.W. Bush. He knew he was going to get a sharp challenge from the right. So he has been preparing for this as best he can. And the party, the Senate re-election committee, is very much behind his campaign. The Democrats all went and they stood by Lieberman, but the Republican senatorial committee has run ads attacking Mr. Laffey.
The Democrats, oh, I see what you're saying. Okay,
yeah, they've gone so far as to attack another Republican.
Steve Laffey.
Steve Laffey.
Who is he?
Well, he's the Cranston mayor, and he is a native of Cranston, and he is a financial services expert by background, Harvard MBA, that sort of thing. He's a smart guy, but he's a fighter. And he definitely comes from the conservative wing. He's a fiscal conservative and a social conservative. But what makes him, I think, particularly interesting is he laces all of that with sort of democratic warfare language. He points to Chafee as this elite, rich, wealthy guy who just wants to waltz into his daddy's old Senate seat, whereas he is the son of a labor union tradesman. So that could have some cross appeal in Rhode Island. We'll see.
And it's an open primary. What is the impact of that?
Well, that's Chafee's lifeline. The Democrats can't vote in his primary, but the independents can, and they are the largest group of voters in Rhode Island. It's amazing when I went and got the numbers. There are like 950,000 registered voters in Rhode Island. It's about more like 800,000. There are 68,000 Republicans. You can't find them in the state. I mean, it's amazing. But there are 350,000 independents. And those are the ones that Chafee has to bring into the primary to vote for him to offset the losses that even he admits will probably be pretty sizable among the Republican base.
Jean, when you describe these bookends with Lieberman, with Chafee, what do you learn from that about the country? What do you learn, what lesson can be taken away from what we've seen?
Well, it seems to me that what we have is, over the past couple of cycles, both the Democrats and the Republicans increasingly have come to rely upon their activist base to get out the energy, to get out the vote, to turn out the vote. And both talk a good line about appealing to swing votes, but in the end, everything they do in Washington is aimed at their base. Well, they've empowered the base, and the base now is pretty upset, and on both sides, the base is starting to flex their own muscle.
Mm-hmm. And go ahead.
There was some question about whether the White House praise for Lieberman was hurting him or what. I'm curious whether what the White House approach to Chafee is going to be and whether that hurts or helps him.
The White House on this race has been relatively quiet. It's interesting how much they wrap their arms around and are full of praise for Lieberman, who, by the way, now has jumped ahead in the polls because the Republicans in Connecticut are now lining up behind his independent candidacy, undoubtedly taking cues from the White House. Mm-hmm. Whereas in Rhode Island, the White House itself has remained relatively quiet. There's no love lost between Bush and Chafee. But then again, you know, in contrast to that, though, the senatorial committee under Senator Dole's leadership has been very aggressive in trying to save the seat because they are convinced that if Laffey comes out of that primary that he can't possibly, he and his 68,000 Republican base can't possibly win.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. Who's going to beat him? Is there a Democrat?
There is a Democrat. His name is Sheldon Whitehouse. He's a former attorney general. He's supposed to be a pretty good campaigner, and he's been around the state, a long family name, just like the Chafees, so he's a pretty strong candidate.
Okay, well, we'll be watching this. I think this is going to be a really fun midterm election. It really is. I get, does this mean we have to go to Rhode Island? Sure, we love Rhode Island. Not that we don't love it. Thanks, everybody. We're done here, but there is more on the web, webcasts, podcasts, and even a live web chat with me next Thursday at noon Eastern. Send feedback and questions, nice ones, to WashingtonWeek@pbs.org. Also, keep up with daily developments on the News Hour with Jim Lara. Then we'll see you next week right here on Washington Week. Good night.
Washington Week was produced by WETA, which is solely responsible for its content. Corporate fund. Washington Week was produced by WETA, which is solely responsible for its content.